conversation between Emilie Pine, author of Notes to Self, and Saras Jones. My name is Stef Klops, and I'm a professor of English literature at Ghent University in Belgium. I'm also an outgoing member of the executive committee of the MSA. I'll be chairing this session, even though some of you know that wasn't the original plan. The session was supposed to be chaired by my EC colleague, Thea Sinbach-Andersen. Unfortunately, though, she has had to cancel at the 11th hour due to a family emergency. She is in our thoughts today. However, the show must go on. I'm happy to step in for Thea, not only because she's a dear friend and colleague, but also because I'm genuinely excited about this panel. I've been looking forward to it ever since it was first announced for the Charlottesville conference last year, and I'm sure that's true for many of you watching. After all, I'm a longtime fan of Emilie Pine and her work, not least the exquisite and phenomenally successful collection of personal essays, Notes to Self, mentioned in the title of this event. In fact, I was so blown away by this book when it came out in 2018 that I've been recommending it all over the place ever since. It really is spectacular. I can't say enough good things about it. However, I have a panel introduction to get on with, so I'll try to stop fanboying now and present our two speakers to you. Emilie Pine is a professor of modern drama at University College Dublin in Ireland. Her research interests lie in the fields of Irish studies, performance studies, and memory studies. She's a past editor of the journal Irish University Review, the founding director of the Irish Memory Studies Network, and the PI of a high-profile research project on the legacies of institutional child abuse in Ireland called Industrial Memories. Moreover, she serves on the advisory board of the MSA. Emilie is the author of two monographs, The Politics of Irish Memory, Performing Remembrance in Contemporary Irish Culture, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2011, and The Memory Marketplace, Performance, Testimony and Witnessing in Contemporary Theatre, published by Indiana University Press in 2020. Her academic work considers the responsibility and labor of giving testimony and the commodification of witnessing. However, since the 2018 publication of Notes to Self by Tramp Press, Emilie is no longer just a scholar whose work is respected and admired by an ultimately narrow academic audience. That collection of deeply personal essays in which she tackles difficult and painful subjects like addiction, infertility, and sexual violence has won the hearts of the general audience in her native Ireland and far beyond, becoming an international bestseller. The book garnered a whole series of awards, including the Irish Book Award for Book of the Year, and it has by now been translated into 15 languages. And the local organizers of this conference will be pleased to hear that Polish is among them. Emilie will engage in conversation today with Saras Jones, who is a professor of modern languages at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Sara has published widely on different aspects of memory studies, with a particular interest in post-socialism, transnational remembering, and first-person accounts. She's the author of The Media of Testimony, Remembering the East German Stasi in the Berlin Republic, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. Moreover, she was PI of the AHRC-funded research network Culture and Its Uses as Testimony, of which Emilie was a member, and which resulted in the forthcoming Palgrave Handbook of Testimony and Culture. That network also led to a follow-on project on which Sara and Emilie collaborated with the title Testimony in Practice. Testimony in Practice gave rise to an innovative theatre production that combined first-person and literary witnessing on stage, alongside a multimedia exhibition and a series of practitioner workshops. The conversation between Emilie and Sara will be free-flowing, but consist of three main parts. They will start out by talking about Notes to Self and what it means to write a memoir as an academic. Emilie will also read a passage from the book. Next, they will discuss their involvement in testimony projects And finally, they will address experiences of burnout and the cost of being academics. Afterwards, you will have a chance to ask questions of Emilie, Sara, or both of them yourselves. You actually don't have to wait until the end of the session to post your questions. You can start doing so right away if you like, whether you are watching the live stream on the conference website, on Facebook, or on YouTube. On the website, you can use either the chat or the Q&A tab next to the live stream window. On Facebook or YouTube, simply comment on the video that you are watching. All these channels are being monitored by a technical moderator, Sofia Rosinska or Lorena Ortiz Cabrero, who will pass your questions on to me. I will read them out to the panel members. Our aim is for this session not to exceed 75 minutes, so as to ensure everyone gets a break before the next session. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Emilie.
Wow, thank you, Steph, for such an incredibly generous introduction, and lovely to be part of this conversation with Sara, who I've collaborated with. And thank you hugely to the MSA for the invitation to talk about writing as yourself. This will emerge as I'm having a conversation with Sara, but part of the motivation for writing this book was deep frustration with how unsubjective our academic writing is meant to be, and how little space there often is for ourselves, our bodies, our emotions, and so on. I'm going to read a short part from Notes to Self. You'll be glad to know I'm not reading from the Polish edition because I can't read Polish, but I'm also incredibly privileged to have this book and to have it translated in particular by Joanna Figiel. It's one of the greatest kind of honors of my working career to work with translators. So I'm going to read from the last essay to start off with in Notes to Self. And in particular, I'm influenced to do this by, sorry, I'm moving on the screen. In particular, I'm influenced to do this because of a roundtable I was part of on Monday at the conference, talking about doing memory studies differently and, well, how we need to, and what it is like working in the university currently. So apologies if you were hoping to escape academic politics in this session, they are front and foremost of this work. So this essay is about being an academic, and the first half of it deals with the particular stresses that women face within academia, and the second half deals with burnout. I'm going to read little excerpts from both halves. Here goes. A few years ago, I was asked to present during my department's research day. I didn't think I should give a presentation because I hadn't done anything spectacular, but the organizer said people would be interested, and he reiterated the request. So I said yes. I regretted saying yes in the lead up to speaking. I regretted it during and afterwards too. I regretted it because even though the project I was working on was good, I was a mess. It was nearly Christmas. I had recently moved house. I had unrelenting insomnia, and I had just had a miscarriage. I told no one at work about the pregnancy, save my boss. I was tired and I was numb. So I gave a vague and an unimpressive talk about my research, but all I really wanted to say was that I felt sad. I see now that saying I felt sad would have been a worthwhile contribution, not because my sadness warranted attention, but because though we were all close colleagues, none of us was discussing the emotions we bring to our jobs and the emotions we generate through our work. Instead, we were busy impressing each other with our professionalism and our ambitions and our achievements. And looking back, I think that was dishonest. Yes, it might have been weird for me to say I felt sad, and that's precisely why I didn't do it. But it might also have enabled us to talk about vulnerability as well as capability. That range of feeling is worth claiming, worth talking about. But I didn't claim it, and I didn't talk about it for one reason. Because to say I felt sad would, to me, have been dangerously feminine. When I examine my antipathy to emotion at work, I realize that I think feelings, Having them, showing them, talking about them are not just a sign of femininity, but a sign of weakness. I have internalized the idea that to be taken seriously as an intellectual, I have to deny all those feelings, all that femininity, all that weakness. I think this in spite of myself and in spite of my feminism and all the women on my reading lists and all the women forward events I organize and all my research on women speaking out and all my criticism of manals and all the posters on my office door advertising marches for abortion rights. Because it turns out I am sexist too. Because it turns out the qualities I generally associate with women, love and support, empathy and nurturing, are not those I associate with being successful at work. In contrast, crushingly, being successful to me meant being a workaholic. I receive 2 emails a week on applying for funding. 2 emails, that's easy to ignore, right? But then there's the 3rd email, the weekly President's Bulletin, which includes a list of all the people in the university who have been awarded external funding. This is how we all get the message. Yay for the overworkers, yay for the financially successful few, boo for the rest. I could try to shake it off. I could find other markers of esteem. But when I realized that only money got you really noticed, I started to read the funding emails and I clicked on the links and I rethought the potential of my research to deliver grant checks. And when I eventually got a project funded, I celebrated because here was proof. I was successful. But suddenly, of course, I also had 2 jobs. After I got the grant of hundreds of thousands of euro, which I had no idea how to manage, I looked fine, performing an image of success, book contract, funded project, editing a journal. But in reality, I was having a silent breakdown. I stopped being just sad and I started being depressed. I did not read depression as a danger signal. I did not step off the treadmill and I did not get help. I thought that my depression was a sign of character weakness. I thought that if I could only stop wasting so much time being sad, I could be more productive. I worked longer hours to disguise the depression. Sometimes I was so tired and so sad that I would lock my office door, turn off the light, and lie on the floor. The smallest tasks felt like they would defeat me, and I beat myself up for the tiniest mistake. I looked at other people who didn't seem to be drowning the way I was, and I wondered how they did it. When a colleague told me that she began her research work at 9 p.m. after the kids were in bed, I didn't feel pity for her. I was jealous of her discipline. I got so tired after weeks and months and almost a year of this, and so uncaring of myself, that one day I found myself driving my car into a wall. There is no mechanism for me to go to the people who run the university and say, hey, you know what, guys, and it is mostly guys, it might be time to tell your employees to slow down. That memo will never get sent. In fact, I can't even imagine it being sent. In acknowledging this, I don't really blame the austerity-hit university for trying to turn its precarious employees into revenue hunters and, as a consequence, sucking us dry. Well, okay, I do blame them. But my mental health, it turns out, is my responsibility. I probably don't need to tell you that, but I did need to tell myself. And once I realized that, I wondered why I would ever leave it in the hands of strangers to decide my value. After the car crash, I did not transform myself overnight. And these days, though I am trying to be different, many of the problems I describe here still mark my life. So what has changed? A friend asked me recently. And here is the answer. These days, I have a new to-do list. Actually, it's not a to-do list. It's more like a series of notes to self. I will value my ideas and my feelings. I will write every day because writing is one of the things that makes me feel most alive. I will lecture on and teach what I am passionate about. I will call out misogyny when I find it. I will fight my own internalized sexism. I will be kind to my colleagues precisely because I don't know what or how they are feeling. I will eat breakfast. I will eat lunch. I will eat dinner and not at my desk. I will pay attention to my middle-aged body. I will spend time with the people I love. I will be a daughter and a sister and an aunt and a partner, and not a mother, but a friend. And I will ask my students what they would do if they were not afraid. And I will listen to what they say. And I will remind them with compassion that the real failure is to not try. I am trying, and I am afraid. I am afraid to write about feelings and overwork and depression and breakdown, because I am still convinced that admitting vulnerability makes me seem weak, not strong. I am afraid of confirming that I am powerless. I am afraid of admitting to all the hard stuff, all the bad stuff, all the unlikable stuff. I am afraid of exposing myself. I am afraid of being pitied, of being resented, of being shouted at. I am afraid of being the disruptive woman and of not being disruptive enough. I am afraid, but I am doing it anyway.
Thank you, Emilie. Thank you so much for reading to us, but also for the book. So, of course, in preparation for today, I reread the book, and as the first time I read it. I know you don't like people saying they read it in one go, but I almost did read it in one go because it's so gripping. And you talk there about the fear of speaking out, and of course the book is partly about speaking out. But it's also clear from the book how much time, which we know is in short supply, how much emotional and also intellectual labor went into it. So I think my first question is, why did you write it? What was the motivation, or what was the point in your life when you decided this is what I need to be doing with that time, with that labor?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I sometimes still ask it of myself, Sarah. The reason I don't like people reading it in one go is because I just think that's a lot to take on in one day. Really, I mean, there were several things that kind of coalesced. My father, who had been an alcoholic all my life, in 2013 went into liver failure, which was the thing that I had feared, again, my whole life and knew was coming. But even when you worry about it in advance, when it actually happens, you're not prepared for it. And he lives in Greece, and the hospital situation in Greece in 2013 was fairly dire. It's the height of austerity measures, and there were hardly any staff. And so it was just, I mean, the plot spoiler for anybody who hasn't read the book is that my dad is safe and well and hasn't had a drink since February 2013. So in many ways, that was a very happy ending to that particular story. But I felt afterwards, and at the same time as that was happening, I was doing all the grant applications and working, way too long, like working 50% longer than I was actually contracted for on a weekly basis. And also going through fertility problems myself, such as the miscarriage I referred to in that essay. And all of these things coalesced to make me have the kind of breakdown that I describe in that essay, at which point I thought, right, well, something has to change. And that thing changing began entirely privately. So it's part for me of the joke of the title was that I wrote it for myself, and never imagining that it would get published, but needing desperately to have some kind of, to get it out of my body. And I think a lot of witnesses talk about this sense of a visceral release of writing something down. And then just but kind of not by accident exactly, because I did send it to them, but I sent the book to an Irish publisher looking for their opinion rather than asking for it to be published. They're a really small, independent feminist press. They said, we'd love to publish this. When they did so, I thought it would, people would be nice to me, and then it would sink without trace. And it just became this kind of phenomenon. It was published in 2018 in Ireland, which was the year that the country voted to legalize abortion. And I'm really aware, talking today about the context of this conference being hosted in Poland, and how reproductive rights for women are being rolled back on for so many people around the world. And while that wasn't the reason I started writing, it's certainly a context for it, right? Because I experienced the difficulties of living in a country where abortion is completely illegal and where if you need a termination, you have to go to the UK or Amsterdam. And so that sense of having all of these stories inside me that needed to come out, and there being an almost volcanic pressure, and 2013 was the year that that volcano kind of exploded. And what I found subsequently is that publishing it is this kind of moment of catharsis, which I guess was what I was looking for, but also this incredible way of connecting with other people. So that was not part of my conscious reasoning for writing it and publishing it. But now I look back and I think of it as one of the biggest dividends of it.
I knew I'd do that at least one. You talk about it as a volcano exploding. I mean, I think what's perhaps interesting is that is it one volcano, or was it a series of mini volcanoes? Did you conceive of the book as from the start as being a particular series of essays addressing these different things in your life, or was it more this one volcano explodes and then this other one, and then you put them together into such a wonderful collection?
Yeah, I think it's probably best described as a series, or an unstoppable flow, right? That just keeps coming. And that is the amazing thing, that once you start going, oh wow, well, let me tell you all this other thing. And that's this. I mean, I think so much of the reason we sanitize our own stories, or we don't tell people publicly about them, is this kind of fear that we have of intruding on other people's lives, oversharing, and breaking the rules of tact, right? But actually, what you're doing is making yourself smaller in it. And one of the knock-on effects of this kind of volcanic explosion is that I started thinking anyway, well, maybe I could be larger, and maybe I could dream bigger. And it was really the publishers who did that for me, who said, we could publish this. And I hadn't allowed myself to conceive of that. But it's amazing. And I said, well, how would the book be? What would the book really be about? Because at that point, I only had the kind of first essay, which was one about my dad in hospital and, nearly bleeding to death and so on. And they said, well, it could be about anything you want. And that was this huge permission slip. And I think so many people, I think women in particular, but a lot of people need to be given permission. And I can't believe, looking back, that I did. And there's this irony, right, that we are these academics with platforms to speak. We talk for a living, and yet we still feel like we're silenced in lots of ways. And so I had completely bifurcated, as I said in that reading, feelings belong over there. And here I am trying to be professional, and I should keep those things separate. But actually, this gave me permission to bring those two things together.
Yeah, and certainly you've inspired me to try and do a little bit more of that in my own work as well. But what's quite interesting as well is that you published the book in 2018, as you said, and we started working together on the Testimony and Practice project, particularly in 2019, and I read the book when it came out. And what was strange for me, and I said this to you at the time, is it was a little bit like reading my colleague's diary, just as we were working together. And you quite rightly corrected me and said, well, of course, it's not my diary, though, is it? And of course, it's not. And we know that as memory studies scholars. So can you just talk a little bit about the process of kind of selecting and editing and rewriting that went on from perhaps those original notes to self to the published volume?
Yeah, because there is a distinction between the first draft, which I really wrote in a very private way. And I decided in the first draft that I would try to hold nothing back. And it would be just a download really onto paper. Well, actually, no, I did. I wrote it longhand first, but that sense of being completely open. And in the second draft and the final version, I really had to decide about impact. So what impact did I want it to have on me, and what impact did I want it to have on my family in particular? And you and I, Sarah, have talked about this, so it's not just about permission for me from the publishers, right? But it's about permission from my family. And that was really important to me. There are lots of memoirists who don't care, right? They ask for forgiveness, if that, afterwards. But it was really important to me that was part of the process all along. So I needed to decide on several things, like obviously selection, what got in and what didn't. When after my parents had read it, it was gently, and they were, I have to say, incredibly supportive, but it was gently pointed out to me that I had got some stuff wrong. So that was really important to kind of update that. But also I could tell that they were hurt, right, by certain aspects of the book. And I had to decide what right I had to memorialize our lives, because we are relational, right? We don't exist purely as islands. And so what to include and what to exclude was really about not censoring, but really deciding what was the important thing for me to say. And I decided, and again, lots of people take different approaches to this, but I decided that I had the right to disclose anything I felt or I experienced, but not to describe the feelings or experiences of other people where they didn't intersect with my life. And so one of the kind of editing principles was about taking out references to events that I was not part of. And this is, you see it in a lot of very self-conscious memoirs, and it's kind of really lovely by other people, really lovely kind of acknowledgement of the unreliability of memory. I wasn't there, so this is what I have been told happened, but I'm not, not 100%, I'm not a reliable witness. And I had written kind of like that, following those models, but I decided that I kind of couldn't do that. If I'm not a reliable witness, and how reliable are we of our own experience even, but if I'm not a reliable witness of other people's experiences, then I need to step back from that. So that was a big decision for me. And another one was around tone. So one of the essays describes me being a teenager. And when I was a teenager, I suffered from a chronic eating disorder, and I also was the victim of sexual violence. And these were things that I didn't talk about ever in my life. Like I didn't talk about to anybody. And before I wrote the book, I had never described before to anybody else. And it seems ludicrous, but it was easier to write than to say out loud to those closest to me. So even when I wrote it and I had to tell my family and my partner, I gave it to them in written form so that they accessed it that way. But I had, when I was a teenager, been a kind of wild child, for want of a better way of putting it. And I'd drunk a lot, done a lot of drugs, gone to a lot of nightclubs. So obviously you can see how I ended up as a professor. But even that joke, right, that I make there is typical of how I would talk about myself. I would always have these funny anecdotes or self-deprecating comments that I made particularly about my teenage or my younger self. And writing notes to self, the first draft, I wrote the teenage chapter in that tone of voice, and reading it back. It was my partner, who's an amazing editor and writer himself. He read it and he said, there's something wrong with the tone here. You need to start taking yourself seriously. And I think that's a really interesting part of the memoir project, which is where you step away from self-deprecation. And it doesn't mean you can't be funny, right? But you have to take your story seriously. And that was probably the biggest emotional hurdle I faced, because humor is a defense mechanism. And so I had used being funny about this really vulnerable part of my life. And I did it about my current life, like, oh, I'm so busy, ha ha ha, I never sleep. While actually, the reality was crying at 4 o'clock in the morning because this is the 5th day in a row where I have got no more than 3 hours sleep. So that use of humor, I think, is something that you need to navigate consciously when you're writing memoir.
That's really interesting. I think a few things you just said then made me wonder, what is it like being a scholar of memory studies and all the things we know about the construction of memory, the ways that autobiographies are written in retrospect, and the editing processes. So you've spent a career studying these things, memory theory, the testimonies of other people, the way that they are staged. What was that like then to be doing it yourself? And also, did that activity of doing it yourself kind of feedback productively on your academic work as well? Did it make you rethink some things that you thought you knew about the way autobiographies were written?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the answer to the first part of the question, Sarah, is slightly hilarious in that I thought I was doing something completely different and completely unrelated to my day job. And people would say to me, like, you know, journalists would say to me, oh, you know, how does being a memory theorist influence this? I said, it's completely different. It's got nothing to do with it. Having actually written myself about other people's memoirs and, you know, narrative shaping and selection and editing and so on. And there I was denying it. And I think I mean, that's a sign of wanting there to be a separation rather than there having actually been a separation. So I knew all of these things, and I can see now, with the benefit of several years since I've, you know, finished it, I can see how it made its way in. So there are points where in the narrative where I very self-consciously announce myself as the writer and say things like, I don't know how to write this story, and that is very influenced by the awareness of this narrativization or the storification of memoir and its role. I would say the other direction is really interesting, that we have, I think, the separation between in academia, this is a generalization, but a separation between those who give testimony and those who study testimony. And I feel much more alive now to the vulnerability of giving testimony, to the expertise of those who give testimony. They are not unwitting subjects. And to, I think, the generalizations in terms of the patterns that as academics we apply to witnessing. So I don't think I'll ever use the word kind of closure or catharsis again. And I, in the kind of uncritical way, and I'm talking only about myself here and my work, in the slightly uncritical way that I used to think, oh, you know, you can, and this is what felt true. You can, through telling your own story, take ownership of it, right? And this is something that I had worked on in relation to people who use theatre to perform their stories. But just as you take ownership of it, you also give it away, right? So it's a really kind of troubling situation, but kind of fence that you're on, right? Situation that you're in. So
what was the response then when you gave it away, in terms of the reception? So I mean, how did you've talked a little bit about how you kind of involved your family in the selection process, and thinking about what, you know, your responsibility to them, your relationality with them in the writing process. How did they respond to the written text, and what about the kind of broader reception? How have you found that? And I'm also kind of interested to know how your employer responded.
So my family were nothing but supportive. My mum did have this kind of brilliant moment where she said, I understand why you want to write it, but I have no idea why you would want to publish it, because she is from this generation. And also, obviously, she felt implicated in it. She is from a generation that if there is something shameful happening, you close ranks, right? You go inward on it. You certainly do not tell the world about it. And what I have found from the reception of this is that is a really bad message. That is just so unhealthy. And not that we should all be going around constantly, you know, sharing our pain. But when you are in a context where it is appropriate to do that, then do it. You know, take that risk. It is a risk. It is a risk, and it comes with certain costs, and we can talk more about that. But for me, the reception has been overwhelming. In my work life, and overwhelming in a good way. In my work life, I've had two responses. Colleagues who kind of sotto voce say to me in corridors, I really liked X part. And that will be, you know, and thank you for saying this. And I'm not in the position where I could say this. Or one person who said, you know, alcoholism is an issue in my family. We can't talk about it. So I gave your book to everybody in my family as a way of kind of talking about the thing that we can't talk about. So that idea of being the one who's crazy enough to publish their memoir, and as a result being a way for other people to talk about their lives too. And that is enormously privileged and a bit of a responsibility I had to learn to carry as well. But there was this other weird side effect, which is the full version of the essay that I read an excerpt from is very damning of the sexism and the culture of overwork in the contemporary university. And it didn't go down well. The international bestseller aspect of the book, they love, right? What the content of the book actually is, no, they don't. And there was a photocopy of that final essay circulating among management, university management, and I was called into several meetings about how I had broken ranks. And the thing that I think hurt me the most, and it was definitely designed to get me to be quiet. The thing that hurt me the most was when I was told that this was a personal problem I was having. And other people enjoy research, Emilie, and that, if I needed a break, maybe I should do some more exercise or something as a coping mechanism, as opposed to saying, yeah, there's a structural problem here. And when I talked about morale across the university, when I talked about the way, the email culture works in the university, it sounds so banal when you say that, email culture, and yet it's so pervasive. And the constant exploitation of precarity by the university, as opposed to them saying, we're really sorry, we don't have the income to employ people properly. Instead, they make everybody feel insecure. And as if success is in short supply and this is a competitive model at which we are going to pit you against each other. When I pointed these things out, I was laughed out of it. And again, told that, if I couldn't cope, maybe I should retire from the fray. And that's just such a toxic message. So, in one sense, I consider myself incredibly lucky because so many women who share their stories publicly get trolled really badly. And whether we're talking about social media or kind of more general public response. As I said, I published it in Ireland at a time when the attitudes towards women and their stories were changing. I think it's enormously depressing that the book's evocation of sexism and, for example, around reproductive rights is still relevant in so many countries in the world, which is why I think the book has been published in so many countries. But the thing that the trolling I feel like I got was actually institutional.
Yeah, I think that individualization of what are systemic problems is probably quite familiar to a number of us. What about the kind of other side of it, though? So the fact that the book has been a commercial success, as well as being a fantastic book, and those things aren't unrelated, I don't think. Which is interesting in the way that it also dovetails with your most recent book, The Memory Marketplace, and how witnessing has become a kind of consumable product that has social value, but also then economic value. What was it like then to enter the marketplace, the memory marketplace, with your own story, whilst you were writing this book as well, whilst you were writing your most recent monograph, which I believe came out last year?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for plugging the memory marketplace. Yeah, I was writing them. In fact, actually, I was failing to write the memory marketplace, which was, yes, lovely. I was failing to write the memory marketplace, which is when I started writing notes to self, because I was like, I can't write this book. Okay, I'll go and write something else instead. It's weird. It's really hard and strange to suddenly find yourself basically a commodity. And so there's two sides of it, I think. Both are to do with kind of authenticity and control. The first is that when I was writing it, I felt like I was trying to access, for want of a better way of putting it, kind of real authenticity, what felt deeply authentic to my most authentic voice and self and memories. And that I had complete control over that. I got to decide what went into, what the story was and what went in and what was excluded. the moment that you publish it, you give it away. And I think that that is right? And it can be really productive. So I'm always struck by readers who will often tell me they have a favorite essay, and that is them taking ownership of the book. And I think it's wonderful and shows how creative reading is, right? Because they often say, oh, it's just like what happened to me. And then they will tell me a story which in no way aligns with my experience. And it shows you how we project and we create as readers. And I think that's wonderful. The other side of giving yourself away, though, is that having written about some of the kind of hardest parts of my life and put them in a book, I then seemed to be completely open game for anybody to ask me anything. Deeply personal and detailed questions about my body and my family, and things that I had not put in the book consistently came up. What happened when X? You don't say what happened in Y, like, oh, we'd like to know more about such and such. I had, I was on live television and radio shows where things that had been agreed in advance that we would not talk about were suddenly raised as issues in a kind of surprise way to deliberately get an emotional response from me. And I found it incredibly difficult at those moments not to respond either angrily or by crying, or, to try and keep control of my own reactions to it. So again, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, I have this just different sense now of how somebody who is a witness to their own life gives their story, and then the person who is meant to be listening to that. And obviously people in the media are doing their job, right? There's a public appetite for scandal and for women crying on television. But how that is kind of deeply exploitative. And so you're talking about they want to exploit that authenticity and to control you really as a witness, to control what you get to say and how you get to say it. And it feels, and this is something that you and I talked about in relation to when we did the testimony, which is 2 years ago now this month, and when we did that theatre project, Testimony in Practice, which I'd love to hear you talk about, that idea of how do you protect the original witness, and how do we get what we want, right, as audiences, but not at the cost, and such an enormous cost to the witness.
Yes, thank you. That does segue quite neatly into the second section of what we wanted to talk about, which was the projects with witnesses that we've done together or separately as academics. And you mentioned Testimony in Practice, which, as Steph said, was a theatre performance which staged the life and literature of a Romanian and German novelist, Carmen Francesca Bonciu, and we worked with a theatre company, La Conquesta del Pursuit, who you write about in Memory Marketplace on a different project they did, but they have a series of plays that stage the stories of women, and it's the women themselves presenting on stage. And as you say, in Memory Marketplace, working with Carmen Francesca was different for them, and also I think different for us, because she's a novelist who writes fiction, but it's autobiographical fiction. She's used to writing from the first, well, not from the first person, but from her own experiences, and putting those experiences onto the page, and also talking about her experiences in communist Romania, and interrogation by the and so on. But she described in Memory Marketplace, in the play, she actually reflects on that fact that she knows that she's selling her stories, and she perhaps wasn't aware of that in 1990 when she was, which is where the story of the play starts, when she was traveling from Bucharest to Berlin, that she has to give them stories in order to get passage, basically. But it's clear that by 2019 she's acutely aware that she is selling her stories for us as well. And that awareness, I think, made me feel more comfortable about the fact that we were staging her testimony, because she knew why she was participating, she knew what she was getting out of it, and she also knew what the consequences might be for her of standing on stage. And I know it was very difficult for her, but she was glad that she overcame those feelings. Perhaps you could say a little bit about industrial memories, though, because that was working with a very different constituency of witnesses. Do you see that kind of reflexivity, the kind of awareness of what the exchange value, the commodification is amongst witnesses who perhaps aren't novelists with 30 years experience of writing themselves?
Yeah, Sarah, I think that's a really, really good point, right? About the distinctions between the witnesses' experience and the kind of professionalization of them as witnesses. So what I think of as my real job, I have worked with survivors of, and survivors is the term that I use because that's how they talk about themselves. And I work with survivors of institutions that were designed to incarcerate children and women in Ireland, children who were from poor families and backgrounds, and women who were pregnant and not married. And these people were incarcerated there for anywhere between like 9 months and 20 years, or the rest of their lives in the case of some of the women. So I mean, I specify the length of time that they spent in those institutions to say that this is a cohort of people who are hugely institutionalized. And obviously there are huge differences between individuals within that cohort, but my generalization about them would be they often have a very low standard of education because they were not educated, even though technically they were meant to be going to schools, and they are hugely disenfranchised and socially marginalized. So I come in as a university lecturer with my funded project and ask them to tell me their stories. And I was acutely aware of the power differentials in that. Fast forward a few years of working with this group of people, and I feel that we have relationships now, which is, I think, crucial to doing this kind of work with any kind of ethical overview of it. And one of the things we've done is we've founded an oral archive that's held at my university, which is part of the National Folklore Collection. And the reason for that is because many academics go to groups of survivors and ask them for their stories and then take their findings away to the university, and the individuals who they've interviewed never have access to them again. And this happens whether the interviewers are from the government or from a university. And I wanted to change that to say, okay, let's build up an archive so that researchers can go to the archive rather than to ensuring that the individual doesn't have to give their story over and over and over again. And what I have also found, of course, is that survivors are incredibly knowledgeable. So they're incredibly knowledgeable not only about their own, they are the experts of the institutional system, not us. They are the ones who know, and they're also incredibly knowledgeable. Almost all of them will say, is this what you want? Tell me, what do you want? They know that they are trading something, or they are being asked to be a particular kind of shape of witness. And I think that's very troubling. And I will always say in interviews, you don't have to talk about your experience at the institution. I'm interviewing you as a person, like a whole person. And much more interesting stories come out as a result, right? So of the surprising ways in which people cope with trauma. You don't have to just be interviewing them about the trauma. I think you get to value them as individuals, and we work with people over a long period of time as well. So it's not just a simple single visit. I feel like I'm kind of waffling here about the experience, but partly that's because it is amorphous. It is difficult. And again, this is something we've talked about. When you get funding, or when you are proposing a research project within your university, you have like, here are my objectives and here is my methodology. And then you have to do it and it completely changes. And you realize that the thing that's on your Gantt chart that will take 2 weeks will actually take 6 months. And those expectations, you just have to get rid of them. And instead, go with a survivor-led approach where we are saying, what do you need? What do you want? Not what do we need? What do we want?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and that's I mean, on a different way, because working with artists is a very different experience. But what I've found within the UK context, at least, is that there's very little space for recognising in the ways that we write up these projects. For us, the dreaded impact case study, but also in terms of academic writing, there's very little space for discussion of those messy and complex relationships that actually completely underpin the impact of the work. And I don't mean necessarily, or I don't mean only, the impact of the research on the practice of artists or the practice of the communities and practitioners that we're working with, but also the other way around, and the way that doing this kind of community-led work can transform us as well. I mean, I've said it before, but I wanted to rewrite my book at the end of the Testimony in Practice project, not because I'm not proud of what I produced in 2014, but because working with the artists and seeing how witnessing worked in practice made me feel quite differently about some of the things that were in the book, or made me realize that they could be more complex. And I think the way that impact is framed in the UK, at least, is this one directional thing. So it's the researcher knows stuff, the society, the communities, the artists, they need to know that stuff, so we'll tell them that, and then that will somehow be transformative. And the work outside with other partners can be transformative, but it's a two-way thing, and I think we'd be better for it to recognise that and to emphasise those relationships. And also, as you say, to value their expertise. So we're working with people who are experts in their own subject, so that their professional expertise or their experiential expertise or practical expertise. And it's a really kind of paternalistic or almost kind of colonial attitude to say, no, actually, we as academics, we have the knowledge, and you need our knowledge, so come and get it. Yeah, we're kind of only ever asked about one side of knowledge exchange. We're only ever asked to write up one side of knowledge exchange. And I think that's something that could be transformed and be transformative for us as well. That said, it's also impact work is for us a part of our professional agenda. And I know that Industrial Memories won an award at UCD for impact as an impact case study. How did you feel about that in terms of what you've just said about responsibility to witnesses?
I mean, it's ludicrous as well. I mean, the reason I went for the impact case study award is dual. Firstly, it came with funding, and I needed funding to continue the project. So I'm delighted, and I got it. But I also really wanted recognition. So often the impact case studies that win are science or social science based. And I think it's really important for the humanities to be recognized. And I don't mean that in a really selfless way. I mean that in, like, we are doing a lot of hard work here, and that work is emotionally as well as physically and in terms of and intellectually demanding. And you need to notice that. And so I had to write the impact case study. In fact, you helped me, Sarah. I had to write the impact case study in a particular format, which didn't, I feel, take account of the real impact of the work, or the biggest impact of the work. I was struck by, so one of the things that we do with Industrial Memories is we audio record the testimonies, and they are transcribed by a transcriber, and she does an amazing job of listening to these very difficult testimonies and writing them, and then we print them and have them hardbound like a PhD thesis would look like, and we give them obviously to the people whose memories they are. And this is really, really unusual in oral history projects, and certainly in projects working with survivors. And one of the survivors said to me, a man who I won't name, and he said that he had never told his children about what he had been through, how he had been abused as a child, and by these priests in this institution. And he had given the hardbound copy to his children, and they had read it for the first time. And this has completely changed how their family dynamic works. There's no space for that on the form, but that is by far the biggest thing that I have ever achieved in any work that I've done. It is the most profoundly moving and fulfilling work of my career. More fulfilling than writing my own memoir is to be a witness to people witnessing their own lives. And And it makes me very sad that that impact is not measured. The impact award itself is hanging in the support centre that the survivors run for themselves. They came to the ceremony. I didn't tell them in advance that we had won, which was slightly cruel in one sense. I actually think I just forgot, but they didn't realize until the name was read out, and there was this moment of pure joy of being recognized. These are people who never went to school, who struggle with illiteracy, and here is a university recognizing them. So I'm torn on it. I'm torn by the impoverishment of the work that we do by trying to record it in an impact case study. And then on the other hand, we need those case studies at the same time so that we can keep doing this really important work.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about needing, I don't like the word to prove the value of the arts and humanities. I mean, we're not going to convince anyone who isn't already convinced, I think, of the value of the arts and humanities. But I think it would be a mistake if we tried to absent ourselves from the impact agenda, because then that's just going to confirm the suspicions that some people have that the arts and humanities aren't valuable, and we know that they really, really are. It's a lot of work though, right? Impact work, which maybe kind of brings us back around to where we started in terms of academic work and the risks of burnout. I read your essay again, as I said, the last week in preparation for this session. And I think it resonated with me even more than it did the first time I read it, after the year I think that we've all had. So I think it's the first semester of last year was probably the most difficult semester of my career, with a combination of leadership activities combined with lockdown and not being able to do the things that I usually do to relieve stress. And then that followed by what I thought was going to be a period of teaching relief in order to write my monograph, but turned out to be a period of teaching relief in order to teach my 5-year-old instead. Then I think that I knew that I could feel I was getting close to burnout, and I didn't get to burnout, but I think my driving into the wall moment was when I cut through a tendon in my hand with a tin can, just from a complete moment of absent-mindedness, because of, my mind was going a million miles an hour thinking about other things. So I've been trying, and reading your essay again was like, oh, this is a good mantra, actually, things that I will do, notes to self. But I find it incredibly difficult. And I think after I injured my hand, and it was, of course, my right hand, so just to make it doubly difficult. And colleagues were saying to me, take some time off, stop. And I thought, well, I just can't, because if I do that, then that's going to affect this person or this person. This student isn't going to be able to do that, or this postdoc is going to struggle with that. And I think that's the thing that I found really challenging in terms of trying to care for myself is, what do we do about the other people that we care for, and where's the balance? Which then kind of leads to the question of, what do we give up if we need to stop doing things?
I mean, that is slightly Sarah, and you know that I'm going to say the provocative thing, which is that you and I are both in a very lucky position of having academic success, of professional success, and the dividend of that success is that we are in a place where we are capable of making change. I mean on a purely personal level. On an institutional level, that's another conversation that we can have. I'm going to say that the unpopular thing, which is the only response, is to do less. And sometimes that means letting down people. I don't know how you work that out, but it really does. There is no point being there for that student if you are half dead by the end of it. Like, how are you going to be there long term for them? And how are you going to be there to support your colleagues if you are not functioning? If we replace so much of what the university has taken out with our own bodies, our own selves, and it's not okay. And this is the other thing, is that we are now modeling really negative behavior for the people who are coming behind us, whether that's students or early career colleagues. I published Memory Marketplace last summer, and so what I've done is, over the past 3 years, the joy of Notes to Self is I have started like winding stuff down, right? Seeing how I could get out of things, including, for example, letting you down, Sarah, by emailing you saying, I can't do that essay. I'm really sorry. I really want to be part of this project, but I can't. And you did the I understand entirely response, which is generally how people respond. But I published this book last summer, and one of my PhD students said to me, wow, Emilie, you're a machine. And my first reaction was the classic one of the workaholic, which is like, yes, I am. And people get to see me being a machine. And my second reaction was like, that is horrific. I don't want to be a machine. And I don't want her to kind of like develop professionally in a context in which her supervisor is living this incredibly unreal life. And I thought, right, I have maintained this in the false belief that I am kind of forging a path. And actually mentorship and guidance is the opposite of that. I think probably one of the best things we can do is model work-life balance. And I used to hate the phrase work-life balance, right? Because it suggested to me that there was a big division between working and living. I love my job. I'm living while I'm working. And actually I think about plays and witnessing all of the time. So there isn't a division for me. But, you know, being able to sleep, being able to spend, and this is the other thing, is like sometimes going to work is easier than being with your family, right? Families are hard. And work is hard, but in a different way. And I know that there will be the result at the end of it. And, you know, everyone will go, there's a lot of valorization that goes with stress at work, but not in the home. And so I had fallen into that kind of, you know, horrible model of be successful in one area and not in the other. My relationships with my family are so much better than they used to be, because they do not feel that I'm putting them second, because I wasn't even putting them second, I was putting them fifth, and I was putting myself 10th, right? So I just think you need to ask what you want. Sorry, this has turned into a horrible lecture. I'm not trying to beat anybody up, right? The thing for me was, right, what do I really want to do with my life? How do I really want to live? And I was trying to do 20 things at once, and had this moment where kind of rushing to pick my nephew up from creche, because I was trying to be perfect, crashing my car into a wall as a result. And I had this moment where I realized that I was missing my actual life in the rush to do everything. And my parents are, I mean, I'm lucky that I still have them, but my parents are getting older. And so my sense of my mortality is there too. And we don't get to do this again. So yeah, apologies for going massive on this one, but I think it's an urgent issue.
I think, yeah, you are right. We should model the behavior that we would want. Mentoring is also part of modeling behavior that you'd want to see. And I am constantly telling the people that I mentor, well, you know, just don't do that, don't take that on, don't take that on. And you know, maybe as I try and model good eating behavior, a good exercise behavior, good health and so on for my children, I should probably be doing the same thing in terms of work-life balance for the people that I support and mentor at work as well. I think that might be a good place to end, and to take some of the many questions I can see being posted to you, Emilie, in the chat. So I'm going to hand back over to Steph.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Emilie. That was really great, and the audience was clearly also hanging on your lips. Lots of questions for Emilie have come in. It's been kind of challenging to keep track of them. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, to be honest. And please accept my advanced apologies in case we don't get around to your question. We'll do our best and see how it goes. In any case, the questions and comments will stay up on the website or on Facebook or YouTube for that matter. So Emilie and Sarah can still access and possibly answer them there after the session. To help ensure that we can address as many questions as possible, I thought I'd group some questions together before giving Emilie a chance to respond, if that's okay, Emilie. But let's start with two complimentary comments. Shata Rupa Mishra writes, very touching presentation. Dorota Michalka says, I'm very impressed with these essays. Such private narratives are most compelling, evocative language combined with the courage to talk about yourself and the testimony attitude. Great book. And let's then turn to the questions. I'm going to take two questions together. There's a question from Joyce Martin, who writes, thank you, Emilie, for the courage of talking about vulnerability, and great being with you in the roundtable last Monday. Do you have any thoughts on how such transparency could be possible for junior or early career academics who have to prove themselves? And secondly, for academics of color, and thirdly, for male academics who might also have a hard time expressing feelings? And a related question, I think, from Maria Kobielska. Emilie, I'm deeply moved by Notes to Self. Your book was one of my most important reads, if not the most important of the pandemic year. I wanted to ask about what I find an ultimate taboo for a woman academic trying to narrate her life, which is about failing in the general attempt to be brilliant, to be professional, or to perform brilliance and professionalism, to be delivering what was promised. It is weird, we are sometimes already able to talk about the personal cost of all this, about the breakdown and even traumatic experiences, which your book is the best example of. Still, I find it difficult to think about a way in which I could talk about this kind of failure without self-deprecating, making myself small, as you put it. So I think the question is, Emilie, how to talk about professional failure as a woman academic without resorting to self-deprecation. So over to you.
Wow, amazing comments. Thank you so much. And really generous responses, and also really interesting questions. As you will have gleaned from my responses to Sarah, I don't have a lot of answers to this because I think the context often makes it impossible. I have found myself in scenarios where I want to speak up, and as I said, have a platform for talking, and yet find myself saying nothing. So if I feel that there's a lot at stake for me as a mid-career, I hate late career as an idea, as a mid-career white, highly educated woman, I'm aware of the different the discrepancy then for people coming from early career positions, people of color, and also I think that's a really important point about male colleagues. In fact, some of my favorite responses to notes have been from men who have said, like, thank you for saying it, because men aren't allowed to say this stuff. And that, I think, is a really very interesting dimension of how sexism has influenced silencing for men as well as women. And in terms of that idea of transparency, I think for me, it has meant, and this comes back to this idea of mentoring, mentors have been incredibly important as allies in terms of finding ways and avenues to talk about or raise or problematize things that have been difficult within the institutional context. So I would say that is a process. I also think that finding people you trust is really important, and it doesn't have to be, I made that joke, right, about, oh, you don't have to be crazy enough to publish a memoir. It doesn't have to be public, right, to count as something being said. It can be a one-on-one, it can be something that you raise in a kind of much lower stakes way. I would always, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, speak out. And on the other hand, I'm like, you know what, mind yourself at the same time. And I think that's part of that self-care process as well. In relation to failure, God, I hate that word. It's such a hard word. It's so crappy. I also think it's hugely related to this idea of imposter syndrome, and how often we feel like we're out of our depth, or we're not qualified to talk about something, or, you know, I'm not a huge success at X, so I'm not entitled to talk about this. And failure then becomes this stick with which we beat ourselves up, as imposter syndrome does. The problem, the imposter syndrome is very enabling because it suggests that you're not alone, right? That there are lots of people who feel like they are failing or flailing. The other side of it, though, is it has become a stick with which to beat women by the way in which it is constantly associated with women. It's like, oh, you should consider yourself an imposter in some ways if you are a female professional. So oddly, I think then as a result, talking about failure becomes politicized in a positive way of saying, like, this didn't work out for me. So it's really important to me to say I was horribly failing to write my academic book, which was why I turned in despair to writing about my own life. I felt like I was horribly failing at my own life as well, and writing about it was my way of controlling that sense of panic and despair. So I think that, you know, failure can be very productive. I'm very suspicious of the narrative that glamorizes failure and says, oh, fail better. And, you know, failure is the path to success. Nonsense. Sometimes failure is just shit and you feel like, sorry, I've gone into swearing now, and you feel like you're at the bottom of the pit. I don't know what to do about that, except to say that you are not alone, and sometimes shouting about it is the best way of expunging it from yourself.
Great, thank you. Two more questions that I thought go well together. There's a question from Magdalena Sarius-Wolska. Sorry for mangling your name. You wrote your book as a non-academic book. Do you think there are ways of including personal experiences in our academic work? Quite obviously, your personal perspective, our experiences and thoughts affect the way that we interpret memories. Should we reveal the personal reasons why we read certain mnemonic narratives in certain ways? So that's one question. Another one from Matteus Marzini. Emilie, for me, your book is a flagship example of the fact that personal perspectives and personal context is fundamental as much as perennial in writing about memory or doing research on it. To what extent do you think that doing a critical decomposition or critical reflection of oneself needs to always be the first step in preparation to work on collective memory of others, such as other societies non-native to us?
Yeah, I think those are both brilliant. I mean, they're more like brilliant points rather than questions, because I would just say yes, absolutely. For me, what I have tried to do is to incorporate being a teacher. So talking about the process of teaching. I mean, I teach theatre mostly, but teaching these narratives and myself as a researcher into the way of telling the story. So talking about how my students react to a particular play, or how the kind of ways in which their discussion has inspired my way of thinking about it. I have also, it's that funny thing that, you know, all writing is always about yourself. I wrote for years about plays in which women are raped before I ever said the word rape about myself out loud. In fact, I think I was actually at the University of Ghent, where Steph invited me the first time. I said it publicly and I was shaking. I will say that it can be nerve-wracking to write about yourself in an environment where we are schooled to be objective. But I think that objective voice is part of the patriarchal machine that we should be fighting. It is a completely wrong-headed idea. And so that idea of making personal experience and foregrounding how you write with the position you're writing from in academic work as much as non-academic work is, as you say, as you both say, fundamental.
Great, thank you. Two teaching-related questions, and that was a totally, memorable talk, Emilie, that you gave at Ghent. It felt like, a gift. But onto the teaching-related questions. There's a question from Karen Remler. How has writing your book and the aftermath that you are describing affected your teaching? And Angelica Bammer asks, can disclosing personal information or perspectives in teaching situations risk opening vulnerabilities among our students that we aren't equipped to handle responsibly?
Yeah, that second one is really important. So on the first, I think I'm aware of other people's feelings in a way that, I mean, I'm laughing because the bit that I didn't read from that essay is that I have zero empathy. I'm really bad at understanding other people's feelings. So part of the work for me is to just try and read other people's feelings. And that obviously includes students. As Sarah said, this has been the hardest year for that. It is incredibly difficult to do that on Zoom. And to understand because they tend to turn their screens off. So they, in an actual real life classroom, I try and make it feel like a safe space. And what I have tried to do is import that into the Zoom room and to make myself available in kind of one-on-one sessions with students a lot more than I usually do, because I think they need that kind of support. At the moment, they're incredibly emotionally vulnerable. I don't tend to share my personal experience because I don't want to overwhelm them. I'm always kind of curious as to whether they know that their teacher also wrote notes to self, because it's become a kind of classic book in Ireland, and is on the end of school, we call it the leaving cert with A levels in England, the end of school curriculum for the English literature exam, which is bizarre to me, but there you go. So I often wonder if they know that I'm that person. But the ones that do know tend to come to my office hours and talk about things in their own lives. And that's that second question about the risk of opening up vulnerabilities. I don't know about you, but I am not trained to know how to help a student in crisis. And I also know that our counselling service is so over subscribed and so underfunded that unless students are prepared to say that they are in some way suicidal, they cannot get an appointment for weeks, if not months. So it's a very, very difficult situation to be in with them. And I think all we can do is be as real as we can about what we can and can't do and how open we are to them. My side note to that is that I do a lot of writing exercises with students, which I didn't used to do, and they are private, they never submit them, and they are not assessed, but they are a fundamental part of my class structure, both inside the class, and then they do them independently as well. And I think that journaling has been kind of a revelation to me in terms of how that can support student welfare.
Thank you. There's a question from an anonymous questioner. Thanks so much for this honest and generous sharing. I am an advanced PhD student who is experiencing mental health issues. Have you ever thought of leaving academia? What made you decide to stay and to leave? And to leave appears between brackets in the question. I assume that refers to your decision to write and publish a non-academic book, or to mentally distance yourself from academia. And I just want to add one comment that's just come in from Anshu Agarwal. This is such a wonderful session. The other day, I began writing about the extremely stressful, hopeless life of a PhD candidate, because I was like, why aren't more people talking about it when I see everyone around suffering? But I stopped because I thought nobody would publish something like that, and thereby there will be no conversation. But your presentation has inspired me to talk about and write about it, so that we can be honest in our experience and how they, in our experiences and how they impact our work. Cannot wait to read the book itself.
Well, yeah, keep writing. I mean, I think sometimes our sense that the other people's expectations will be that our lives are boring is the thing that creates a kind of self-censorship, right? We think, oh, no one else would be interested in this, or no one else is talking about this. In my experience, the things that people aren't talking about are exactly the things we need to be talking about and writing about, and exactly what will make your work special and important to other people. So I think that I would love to read your work. In terms of academia itself and being in or outside it, I had a very, very troubled childhood, and I got to university and finally felt like I was normal. What that says about other academics, I'm not sure, but I think that we are an amazing collection of people. And I know through the Memory Studies Association, I have made incredible friends, and that is one of the things that keeps me in academia. That and the sense of there being a structure. I would struggle to be outside of it. And that is kind of oddly my confession of vulnerability, which is I don't want to be freelance and out there. I need to know that I have a place I belong. And I feel like I do. I also love teaching, and I never anticipated that. That was the glorious accident and discovery of being a PhD student and desperately trying to pay my rent and taking on all of the teaching hours, and realizing that I felt better at the end of the class than I did at the start of the class. And that the way in which students give us so much of their energy is so generous and wonderful. And so that's something I think is really worth celebrating in our lives. But the other side of it is that I became an academic 20 years ago when I started training for my PhD, and it is harder now. It is different now. And so I see my PhD students and postdocs having to leave academia, not just for mental health reasons, but just for they can't get jobs, they cannot make a living wage. And I think this is something that those of us with platforms and voices need to just keep being as noisy as possible about.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll end with one final pair of questions, if that's okay. We're going slightly over time, but you know, I don't think that's a major problem. MSA co-president Jenny Wustenberg writes, clearly the institutional trolling hasn't worked. Are they doing anything about the fact that you are still speaking out? And why did you decide to stay at the university, even though it probably would have, it probably would have had the option to leave the rat race? I think that would be you. Probably had the option to leave the rat race. And a related question from Joanna, the spiritus movens of this conference, as Jeff put it in his opening speech. Emilie, it's a brilliant book and great conversation. Do you encounter diminishing or disapproval of your work of a sort? A good writer, but is she fit for an academic job? Or hate on social media for disclosing so much of your private life? And if yes, how do you deal with it?
The second question first, no, I haven't, amazingly. I anticipated that I would, and I was kind of ready for it, in as much as you can be. And then the disapproval didn't happen. That doesn't mean that I haven't had negative responses, or actually, I think one of the hardest responses, or hardest types of responses, was from young women who will say things like, feminism is over, this is so over. Which, seems to me to be, again, another example of internalized sexism, and not to mention ageism probably as well. I think that I've been incredibly lucky in relation to I actually don't know how I would have dealt with it. And it's funny that I think that when you are doing this kind of project, writing a memoir or finding a way to put yourself out there in some way, it probably helps you not knowing, right? Not thinking about what the response will be, because if you think about that response too much, A, you'd possibly never do it, or B, if you did it, you'd do it to try and please other people or particular audiences, and it's just that would really undermine the point of doing it. Jenny's question about the trolling not working, I'm not sure. I found it pretty daunting at the time. I have to say, to be told by the head of research that I was just a failed example of a researcher, and I find it disheartening, recognizing in myself my desire to please her in some way, so that when I bumped into her on campus, I was like, oh, I'm up to 15 translations now, as if I'm, still trying to impress her. And I probably won't ever get rid of that dimension of my personality. But I, feel like noticing it or saying it out loud is a way of holding myself accountable for it, and for saying, right, okay, this is a long learning process. We never get finished. And I always remember that, actually, with publishing my first book. I remember thinking, oh, I've published my first book. Now things will be different. And it's remarkable, isn't it, that it isn't, right? I think we are encouraged to believe that we get to a point of having finished, and then have to kind of, all we're told by our institutions is, no, now you have to start again. And actually, I think the shift for me has been to think, okay, right, this is a 30-year career, and it will roll in various ways. As I said, I never wanted to leave the security of the institution, but I also, I love my colleagues. I go to work every day. I don't at the moment, or for the past year and a half, but that's what I've missed. And going to conferences, right? Complaining about the warm white wine at conference receptions. How I miss that. And where else in the world, in what other profession would we get that? And would we get to do that? I think for me, being an academic is just such a joy and a privilege, even as I recognize that to be able to say that is a huge privilege.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful note on which to bring the session to a close, Emilie. So on behalf of the MSA, I want to thank Emilie and Sara for a fascinating conversation, and our technical moderators, Sophia and Lorena, for their help running this session. I honestly have no idea where we would be without them. And all of you in the audience for your interest and engagement. I believe we have more than 110 people watching live on the conference website alone, which is just great. By the way, the video of this event will be available not only on the website, but also publicly via Facebook and YouTube, in case you or anyone would like to watch it again afterwards. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. So take care and bye for now.
Thank you so much, Steph and Sarah.